Jews. And we had some talks. You may have heard that the Spanish government eventually exiled or killed or destroyed everybody else except the Catholics. You can maybe try to understand it and overlook it a little bit. You can't overlook it. Maybe you can understand when you realize that they spent 700 years fighting off the Moors. And they felt like, I mean, particularly Queen Isabella, who was more or less in charge because her kingdom was bigger than her husband's Ferdinand's kingdom. Queen Isabella did not believe that there could be mixed religions in a realm. And again, having experienced 700 years of partial Moorish domination or domination by Muslims, maybe you can understand. Anyway, the first act that they did together, her and her husband, was drive the Moors out of Spain. Then they used that same zeal they used to drive the Moors out to proceed to drive out all persons who were not Christian. That included Jews and Protestants. When Isabella and her husband died, they passed the throne on to to Philip, and he died, and passed the throne on to Charles V. He died, and eventually Philip II got the throne. Philip II was extremely interested in making all of Europe Catholic once again, and in destroying all Protestantism. And in the course of trying to destroy Protestantism, he failed, but he did succeed in driving Protestants out of Spain. In the meantime, the King of Portugal also largely succeeded in driving Jews and Protestants out of Portugal. Now, what happened to the Jews? The Jews, having been driven out of England earlier, driven out of Spain, driven out of Portugal, most of them found their way into Germany and Poland. And it was like they were setting themselves up for the Holocaust was to come later, because most of the Jews living in Europe in the 1900s concentrated in the region of, again, Germany and Poland. And that led to one of the greatest mass murders in all of history, when Adolf Hitler decided to eradicate the Jews. And we found groups of them living right there where you could easily reach them. I'll talk more about the, well, actually I will talk a little about the Spanish Armada now. Philip sent a fleet of ships to England to try to conquer England. The fleet was destroyed. This was the disastrous attempt called the Spanish Armada, excuse me, that occurred in 1588. Don't worry about the date. Anyway, Philip II died bankrupt. And that was a shame, because Spain had all this gold come in from the New World, the gold that Pizarro had taken. They had all this gold come in from the New World, and eventually the gold managed to cause a big wave of inflation in Spain and jack up the price of Spanish products really high. So the people of Spain began buying products that were made in other countries, and this gold found its way to other countries of Europe. The king died bankrupt. King Philip, as did his son. You might ask the question, can governments really go bankrupt? We're facing the same thing in our country. Governments of the world can and do go bankrupt. And it's nothing new. Philip went bankrupt. His son did too. All right, now we come back to Elizabeth. Elizabeth I. I've already mentioned how that Elizabeth got the throne on the death of her half-sister Mary. Her admirers have called her Good Queen Bess. She lived a long time. She never married, so she's known as the Virgin Queen, and the state of Virginia is named after her because she's known as the Virgin Queen. What was her problem? Why did she not get married? Here's my own personal take on it. A woman or a young girl gets her first impression of men from her father. Well, who was Elizabeth's father? Henry VIII. How did Henry VIII treat women? Well, for one thing, Henry VIII married Elizabeth's mother, and then had her murdered. So Henry VIII executed Elizabeth's mother. Do you think this didn't have an effect on young Elizabeth? In addition, Henry VIII went from one woman to another. What most history books won't tell is that Henry VIII had the habit of standing on the street corners of London with his royal robes and crown on his head and brag about his sexual exploits with women using all the four-lettered words in the English language. And yes, those four-lettered words were in use back then. And with a father like that, it's understandable why that Elizabeth would grow up possibly frigid. In addition, it's known that Elizabeth was, during the time when her sister was queen, she was sent from one caretaker to another, and one of her caretakers molested her. Again, that all this may have had everything to do with why she did not like men. Yes?
How did he kill his wife?
What's that?
How did he kill
Henry VIII had Elizabeth's mother executed.
Oh, just...
Yeah, just I believe beheaded.
Oh, okay.
The upper classes in those days were beheaded. The lower classes were hung. That was a standard procedure. The beheading was considered a quicker means of death than hanging. Yes.
What did you say her admirers called her?
Or what?
Her admirers, those
I called her Good Queen Bess. Yeah, Good Queen Bess. Another feature that he had that makes me think she was a frigid woman, she would carry out long flirtatious relationships, often by correspondence with some of the leading men of Europe, only to cut them off. She'd encourage these men and then cut them off, encourage them, cut them. She did this throughout much of her reign. Nevertheless, her ability to govern, she appears to have been a good queen. Number one, she did not try to force her country to become either Catholic or Protestant. Secretly, she probably was a Catholic, but officially she had to become a Protestant in order to get the throne, because the Catholics would not recognize her. And yes, I've seen Catholic literature to this day. The Catholics still call her illegitimate, and I can understand why. She also avoided wars in as much as possible. However, there was one war that was more or less forced upon her. King Philip had a section of Holland called the Spanish Netherlands, and he was trying to conquer the rest of Holland, especially since the rest of Holland had become Protestant. He was determined to make Holland into a Protestant country. Well, Elizabeth secretly sent aid to Holland, and this was found out about through spying or whatever. They had surveillance networks back then, and it was found out that Elizabeth I was aiding the people of Holland in their fight against Spanish domination. So King Philip decided to send his armada. The armada was composed of about 100 ships called Spanish galleons. These galleons, I mean, if you look at them, they looked like they were top-heavy, and they actually were. And all England had was 30 ships to meet the 100 Spanish galleons, but these 30 ships were led by a man named Sir Francis Drake. Drake had been a pirate and had taken a whole lot of silver and gold from the Spanish vessels that the Spanish were carrying from the New World back to Spain. Drake was the pirate, but the 30 English ships were much faster than these Spanish ships. And that gave the English an advantage. In other words, if the English didn't want to fight, they could always run. But the Spanish had no way to run off. But during the course of the fight, a gale came up. And the gale was of such a size that it was not particularly frightening to the English ships. They could seemingly handle it. But it was very frightening to this top-heavy Spanish galleons. And make a long story short, the English were able to sneak up on a Spanish galleon. Maybe not sneak up is not the right word. They couldn't really sneak, but they were able to get close to a galleon and set it on fire. Then they would sail over to the next Spanish galleon, and sometimes lower a lifeboat and set the lifeboat on fire and shove the lifeboat toward the Spanish galleon and set it on fire. All told, almost all of the Spanish armada of 100 ships were burned up in the ocean. There was one galleon that escaped. It went all the way around the British Isles all the way up around Scotland and sailed around and found its way to a port in France. But just about all the rest of the Spanish galleons were burned. There have been historians who have said that Spain has never recovered from that disaster to this day. Spain ceased to be a world power on the continent of Europe, ceased to be being a powerful country on the continent of Europe. As for Drake, he, in his old age, these old admirals would like to get together and brag on what they had done. In his retirement, he'd get around the cafe houses and saloons and brag, "I burned up King Philip's beard." Speaking figuratively, of course. Big victory of the English, and it guaranteed that both England and Holland would remain independent of Spain and would remain Protestant countries. Actually, your book says a number of the Spanish galleons went around Scotland and went around Ireland. But then they were even further pounded by storms even there. All right. So much for the time being for the wars. Moving on. Hey, folks, some of this I'm about to say might be a little bit controversial, but I've not had many people in my class dislike it. Population decline. Page 435. All right. What, for those of you who read the assignment, what caused the population decline in the late 1500s?
The Black Death.
What's that?
Black Death.
The Black Death was in the early 1300s. Not quite, even though it was similar. Right? The same thing that actually is believed to cause the Black Death, we know caused the same. What happened in the early 1300s and repeated again in late 1500s that caused a big population decline in Europe? The weather. What happened to the weather? In one word, the weather cooled down. This happened in the 1300s. This is in a book. It's called The Little Ice Age. It was so bad that even poor old Queen Anne, who had something like 13 pregnancies, half her children were miscarried. Most of the rest of them died, were stillborn. One or two of them were born alive but died, and only one of them lived to be 10 years old. And then Queen Anne died completely childless. Even the aristocracy, even the upper class, did not escape. How would the Ice Age, Little Ice Age, bring about such a disaster? Here's what it did. It lowered people's resistance to disease because the crops were bad. Failed crops meant famine. Famine even among the animals. So that even the meat they ate was not as good as the meat that their ancestors had eaten. The crops, when they brought forth, they were not as healthy or nutritious as crops had been before. Again, owing to climate cooling. What am I getting at, folks? And this is something I've never had a pupil argue with me over. It appears to me that the hotter the climate is, the better life on Earth is. And the colder it gets, the worse life on Earth is. If this is really true, why would we be worried about global warming? Now I know I had one pupil talk about, well, the Antarctic ice might melt and cover up some land. I'll deal with that in a minute. And actually, I had a student write a paper on it, and he talked about a certain island that was once above water that was now underwater. And I had to ask him, well, I've been to Florida and I haven't seen the ocean levels rise, but how can the rising water submerge one island and not submerge others? Personally, I think this island that's being submerged is just simply sinking down a bit and not being. All right, something else I'm surprised a lot of you may not know. When ice melts in water, the water level does not rise. No, if the ice melts, if an iceberg melts, I mean, if all the ice in the North Polar regions were to melt, the ice that's in water, it would not raise the level of the ocean. The level would say, oh, you put a bunch of ice, an ice cube in glass, and this ice cube melts, the water level in the glass does not rise. Now, have any of you been taught this in physics classes? Okay, the water level in the container does not rise. The volume is the same. Yeah, the volume is the same. Now, what about the Antarctic ice? 3 miles thick. If it did, it might raise the level of the ocean.